In the post side, we're still a little bit limited in how to make these things, so everybody's scrambling to use a couple products that are out there. Sony is shipping a professional grade reference monitor for $20,000+. It's a great 1,000 nit display. Dolby has the PRM 4200. They have some others that people have seen in the lab that produce higher brightnesses. Canon showed a great demo of a 2,000 nit 4K monitor just a couple months ago, and in fact last week they had, let me say, 8 of those units on display. So even though it's not quite being sold, it should be on the market certainly by January. So for the most part, most of the masters people are doing are either on a projector that's been tuned to do some HDR, or using the 2 devices on the left. And that's kind of where everybody is right now. But it is limiting us a little bit. So, so then the other question is about what do you have to think about in production when you want to make an HDR show from the beginning, rather than taking old content and trying to remaster it. What do you have to do for current production? And this is where ASUS comes in. So first, I really like this slide because this is the future, right? A DP is just going to talk to his camera and tell him what he wants and how to get it, and the camera will know, and it will produce whatever format. You don't even have to know what the data is, it just happens. That's the future I think we all dream of. In the meantime, we're in much more detailed, dreary tedium of dealing things like, this. So one of the things for HDR is we're going to have to manage tone scales, the gray to white reproduction range. So let me ask another question. How many of you have heard of ASUS? Almost everybody, that's great. So our marketing guys have done great at getting the word out that ASUS exists. How many of you have used ASUS in a project or in a test? One person, okay, excellent. All right, so ASUS is a project of the Academy, been worked on for about 10 years. It was started knowing HDR was part of what our future was. It was also started knowing we wanted to interoperate with film. And tone scale management was part of our goal because that is the thing that Kodak has given us for 70 years. Negatives were very straight. They just captured as much of the scene as they could. And the rendering details of how colorful to make it and how contrasty or low contrasty, that was all in the film print. So the film print would figure out, from the negative when you printed it, how much density to make, and that would go out and be reproduced in the theaters. So we wanted that split between a capture that just got everything and a render on the output that would do the things that make it look good in different environments, whether film or television. So this is a graph of the characteristic curve of ASUS, which more or less is the same as a Kodak Vision print stock. It has an S-shaped curve. It flattens out on the left at the bottom, which is the shadow detail way down in the darks. It has an overall slope that's about a 1.5 gamma, which is appropriate for cinema environments or a dark surround theater. And at the top, it has a roll-off at different levels based on how much brightness you want in your highlights. So the red one, which is a little darker, that's a cinema output. 48 nits is the cinema standard. The green one right above it is 100 nits, Rec 709 or Rec 2020 for that matter. It could be either one. The blue is 1,000 nit P3 ramp. The cyan is a 2,000, and the purple at the far end is 4,000 nits. And the base ASUS file after our render is 10,000 nits. So we just have a straight line that goes all the way up to cover that eventuality, although we think that's going to be somewhat rare. So one of the things you can notice here is that the performance of what your highlights do is pretty similar in all three of the HDR versions at around about between a little over 1. So 10 to the first is 10 in the ASUS units. And what does that mean? 10 is the equivalent of 1,000% reflectance card. So a 10.0 in ASUS is 10 times a neutral density, a neutral reference white of a 1.0. So if you know video scales, 1.0 is usually where white is placed. So this one is saying that at 10 in ASUS, you're 10 times brighter than where you would place this reference point in video. There aren't actually a lot of things that go up that bright except the sun and glints from the sun and flames and certain things like that. Ordinary skies might only be around 5 or 7 or 500 or 700% reflectances if you put it in a reflectance scale. So I'm bringing this up now just because I'm going to show you a couple pictures in a minute, and you'll be able to see what that really means. Another thing that has to be managed is color reproduction. Again, a dense slide, but each of the small triangles here is Rec. 709, and the largest triangles going off to the right is Rec. 2020. So you can see along the bottom is a scale of chroma, which is how intense is the color, and on the left is a scale of luminance, L star, which is a perceptual scale as part of the CIE LUV color system. So this gives you a rough perceptual volume of Rec. 2020 and Rec. 709 and P3 for ordinary video brightness of 100 nits. And you can see that you get a lot more color out of Rec. 2020. When you're manipulating things, you wind up pushing colors out there to try to make them reach, because ordinarily in normal video you don't, if you're right in the middle there, no, I gotta walk over again, I should have brought a laser pointer. If you're right in the middle here, that's the most extreme colors you can get out of 709. Here's where the most extreme P3 is these two, and then that's, those two are Rec. 2020s. So anyway, it's giving you a sense of the volume of color. So now I'm going to do the same thing, except that everything I just showed you, the maximums are down in the lower left, and the volume in the right now is scaled for 1,000 at HDR. So you can see how much more perceptually colors are available. It's much brighter, a much bigger volume. The problem of taking all of these colors and squeezing them down into the 100 nits is the thing I called color volume remapping. And there's no single method that works there because the volumes are just such a difference. So lots of things are being tried. Some of them quick and cheap, some of them expensive and hard, but it's typical, and eventually they'll figure it out. So ASUS is a system designed to address some of these problems. We've known about them for a long time. We didn't have to deal with them because cinema and video really aren't that far apart from each other. But we wanted to design a color management system for the film industry and television and content creation. And this effort involved over 50 companies, 184 people on the committee. It took a long time because there was a lot of philosophical questions that had to be addressed. Some of them is basically log versus linear. What does that mean? What do you do? How does that impact things? And then to design a working framework that would handle all the varied productions that we knew we wanted to deal with. So I'm going to give just a quick overview of some of the concepts of ASUS, and then just give an update on where we're at today, because we've sometimes spent an hour just going through all the philosophy and design goals of ASUS, and I didn't really want to do that tonight. So I'll give a quick reminder of the overview, and then getting to an update on what we've been doing up to date. So the basic system, ASUS in the middle there, is a color space. It's a 33 stop range. It can capture all the detail from just about any camera you might ever have. It's half floats, so it's very precise. You can do it in floating point as well, or full floating point, but that's usually too much data. So the idea is that we try to maintain calibration with the original scene colors. So if you put colors on set, the idea really in a good system is to maintain consistency of treating those colors, and people in the print world have been doing this for a long time. This is not about limiting the creativity, because you can change the colors to be whatever you want. But when you first set up your camera and you capture things, it's kind of nice if the uniforms or the dresses come out yellow because they were yellow on set. And as a starting point, that's what we wanted. On the right-hand side, we have our output side of the equation. Like I was talking before, negative and print. The left-hand side is the negative, the right-hand side is the equivalent of a print. In engineering acronyms, we have the RRT and the ODT. The RRT is a reference rendering transform. The ODT is an output device transform. It's a matched pair. You can change out the ODT for different devices. The RRT stays the same for everything. All you need to do is look at that and say, that's an ASUS viewing transform. It's just whenever you have an ASUS file, you use one of those, and what you're going to see on your device is going to be accurate and consistent within the color management framework. And so I'm going to focus just on a couple other small parts of the workflow. So to go from the camera, as they talked about, into the consistent ASUS color space, we wanted a calibrated color conversion. We have another acronym for that, of course. IDTs, opposite of ODT. Input device transform takes your camera original color and puts it into ASUS. So it's a combination of a way to linearize into a linear light space, what the camera does. Most of the cameras shoot in log, but also convert the colors with a specific transform to go from like S-log3 or Array-log into the ASUS color space. And when you do that, you start to get results like I'm about to show you. So all of the material here is being shown as our dailies. These were not color graded to match. This was after we did the calibrations of the camera. We're using the film one as somewhat of a reference. We also have a film calibration for different film inputs as well. So this was what we got in dailies for film versus the red. You can see all the cameras had somewhere between 12 and 15 stops of dynamic range on the capture side. So with the exposures that were chosen, almost nothing clipped. They're very careful to try to get a good match there. Here is what we had with the Array Alexa. Again, almost across the board, a good match, except that there are differences. If you look at the waitress, the Array has a more intense yellow. So although we're calibrating, we're not taking out some characteristics of the camera. So if a camera is more sensitive to certain colors, that's going to come through. If you used a lens that's a little bit more yellow or a little bit different, the lens characteristic is going to come through. So even though we have a systematic calibration to keep things in a common space, differences are not being eliminated. We're not trying to eliminate things that DPs might think are beneficial or things that they liked about a certain camera's look. The Sony F65. You can see even here, even though this is not 4K, that it's slightly sharper than some of the other cameras, which is because it has an 8K sensor. And then on the output transform side, we can take anything from the ASUS color space and use our viewing transform, and matched up to a different set of output display devices, we should get some fairly consistent color. Now here I only have something that's roughly RIC 709, so I'm going to show you a frame that has 6 different styles of our output device transforms, but only one of them is going to be right for this display. If we're on a different display, the other ones would be right. So here is our standard Marcy chart. The one in the upper middle, 709, is technically right, although to me it looks a little washed out in this lighting. But the one in the upper left is an ASUS linear file. So you can see the hair clips, but the data doesn't clip. It's just when we put it into this container to show on this device, it clips. If I were looking at it on a real ASUS display, it wouldn't be clipped. 709 in the middle, P3D60 Cinema on the upper right, 2020 on the lower left. And you can see that, as you would expect, it's a little bit odd to think about, but going from 709 all the way down to 2020, the data in these images is desaturating. but that means that if you were on the proper device, the colors would be identical to each other because the center of the colors would stay where it's supposed to be and be accurate to that display. But when you're looking at them all at the same time, they desaturate instead. And then in the bottom right corner, we have two PQ images, which are PQ 1000 nits, PQ 2000 nits. They look kind of flat and loggish because we're not on a PQ device. If you put this into a PQ display, they would look probably much like the 709, but with more snap in the highlights. So here's a similar thing with another indoor set. The main thing I want to point here out is if you look at the PQ, you can see more detail outside the windows than you can up in the 709 or P3. There's more branches, a little more distinction of stuff, because that's all in the camera negative, and it's just a matter of having the right display, and you can bring it back. Here's another outdoor shot. I put this in because if you look at the histogram of ASUS file on the upper left, a lot of daylight shots don't have a lot of dynamic range. There's not a lot of black, there's not a lot of highlights unless you're looking at the sun. And in normal circumstances, 709 is just enough to cover that. Look at the histogram 709. It more or less covers most of the range without clipping on either side. Same is true of P3D60. So there's a lot of shots that may not need HDR. And one of the dilemmas for mastering is that people come into a room and they sit and they watch some content and then they're like, well, it looks the same as my normal video. Why is this HDR? There's nothing HDR in the shot. So you can fake it. You can make stuff really punchy and really contrasty to make it look HDR, but a lot of times you don't need it. Here's a true HDR photograph. It's a little clipped in the camera, as you can see on the right side of the ASUS file. It hit a wall. But you know, in general, in all the histograms, you know, you're not really clipping very much. Blue does a little bit because it's, you know, it was. You know, blue is, if anything's going to clip, it's more likely to be blue. And then here's another outdoor shot. Similarly, the upper left histogram is more or less nicely centered without a lot of extremes. So unless you like gazing at histograms, this doesn't tell you too much more. But so let's go back to the tone reproduction curve. So as I pointed out, that slot right about 1. If you look back here, look in the lower right at the two PQ ones, they actually look almost identical to each other. There's not very much difference. The main reason for that is they're both more or less at the same part of the curve, where there's no, if you look right, follow the number 1, go straight up and look at the, you know, the 2000 and the 4000, the 1000 and the 2000, they're hardly apart from each other at all. So that for us was, we designed the highlight curve to get a wide range of highlights. A colorist would look at that and say, well, that's not what I want. I'm going to push this all up. I want to have more brightness. I want to have a greater range in the highlights. So they might play around with that, and they might move all those positions of where things happen, because they can, and that's what they do for a living. So all we do is give people a starting point. And sometimes it means, in certain cases, it may not look like anything near what a final is going to look like, because after a colorist is done with it, it might be completely different by that point. But we start out as a common ground, and that was our goal, was to not have people have to start from scratch and go too far. One of the benefits of this is, for several productions already, they did ASUS a couple years ago, and suddenly somebody called up and said, we got this new HDR set. Can you remaster one of your shows for HDR? And at first the exec was like, oh, that's so much work, and we need a couple weeks in a DI room, and we have, you know, et cetera. Turns out, not with an ASUS negative. All they did was, in an afternoon, they re-rendered it with a different ODT, and they sent that back out, and the client was happy with it. They said, that's great. And it was, you know, a simple re-render without changing the creative grade whatsoever. Now, that's not to say that they couldn't have made a better grade if you worked at it with a few more hours, but that would have cost money. So as a quick preview of what would my movie look like in HDR, ODTs get you there within hours, not days or weeks. Another special feature of the ASUS project is look transforms. This means lots of different things to different people, but if you want to customize a look as your starting point, if you want to have an orange, old-fashioned sepia glow thing as your basic look for your movie, you can put it into a look transform. All the color correctors know how to put this into LUT files, and you just turn it on and off. The rest of the HDR negative isn't changed. So you're not clipping or losing the range in the original ASUS file. You're just imparting a pre-baked look. You can do this with ASCDL numbers. Too many acronyms tonight. My tongue is starting to go. You can use ASCDL. You can use 3D LUTs. There's products like Fujifilm has a LUT generator that has 4,000 variants of film, LUTs, and all kinds of things. All of those technically could be look transforms. So it was important for us that creatives could design their looks and weren't limited by our starting point. So now I'm going to sort of update a little bit on some new things. So ASUS 1.0 was released in December to our developer community, our ASUS partners. There were a couple things we found in our trial period, which lasted from 2012 until 2014, that people asked us about and were concerned about. One of them, again, acronyms here, you don't even need to know them, but the wide color space, the red triangle there, is the one that covers all possible gamuts, all possible colors. Some people found it hard to work with, especially colorists. Like it's okay for moving files around, but when we wanted to manipulate our RGBs, we didn't like that space. So we created another space that's the smaller triangle called the ASUS CC, which is a log grading space. It's really intended just for the internals of a color corrector. So you can be as similar to Cineon log grading as you might in a color corrector, and the colorist wouldn't generally see too much difference there. Another thing we created at the same time, which is the same color space, was a request from DPs if they wanted to see what would ASUS look like coming live from cameras. We didn't have a way to do that. Most of our initial setup was converting camera raw into a particular output format. So we came up with ASUS Proxy, which is a 10-bit HDSDI encoding of ASUS. It means you can put it out of the video tap of your camera and put it into a LUT box to apply the ASUS viewing look, however you have defined that. And that will give you an approximation of what the ASUS exposure is. So a DP can then do manipulations and do whatever they want and see what the final output's going to look like. ASUS Proxy is in a bunch of the Sony cameras, Canon cameras. It can be converted to from several other cameras, and it's one of our things we did for on-set support that people had asked about. And then we also had a similar request from the visual effects community. The ASUS color space, again, was considered too wide. They weren't comfortable with it, so once again, we made a linear space for EXR files in a different set of primaries, so we call AP1. And that's just Academy primary set 1. And then lastly, we already had APD, which is printing density for film. So if you want to go in and out of ASUS using film, you have the APD standard encodings. Now, let me just mention one thing about AP1. It's basically Rec 2020. It's slightly outside of 2020, just to avoid some rounding errors and sort of gamut edge conditions that sometimes happen. But it's effectively in the same position as the Rec 2020 primaries. And people have found that to be much more useful than the wide ASUS set. So the AP0, or the ASUS color space, we still use it for the files, the archive, all the final production stuff. But if people want to take it into their box and composite or make texture maps or color correct, they can use this smaller, either ASUS CC working space in log or ASUS CG in linear. And that has turned out to be beneficial to multiple productions now. In fact, we've heard from several people just at IBC in Europe, they've converted their whole facility, even for doing commercials, into using these color spaces. it's getting late. This is too technical. It's basically the same stuff I just said. Next. So production-centric view, you know, we wanted to hit and make sure we covered all of the main categories of work that people would do with color. So this is just laying out where these different color spaces can impact production. Dailies and on set. We have something called ASUS Clip, which is a way to carry color transforms around, or look transforms. If you assign a look to a clip, if you assign an ASCCDL to a clip, that can all be put into your metadata, and as soon as they load that file, that metadata should be present as well. Some of the manufacturers are still working on implementing some of these things, so it's not across the board present, but it's the plan. And then we had production, post-production, editorial, mastering, distribution in the archive, and then visual effects down at the bottom. We also have defined a common LUT format for 3D LUTs and matrices and other transforms. So we're trying to help the entire production metadata environment, which has been a bit chaotic and not well managed, especially as far as color goes. Here's an engineering-centric view. The only thing I'm going to say is the top line is the film chain, the bottom line is digital, and on the right is all the outputs of different displays like digital cinema and HDR video or Rec 709 video. And there's conversions between, with the different arrows, you see conversions between all the key transforms in the system. All right, so let me just try to give you an update on where ASUS is at now. As I said, we released our developer kit in December. It's a set of open source files. Any of you can also download it. It has links to several things online. We have more than a couple hundred pages of documentation on every piece of the system. We have implementation guidelines, metadata. We're working across the industry. We have 24 partners in our program who are working on validating their implementations. We have a logo program where once they're complete, they'll be able to get a ASUS logo on their product page, identifying that it provides full ASUS support for the entire workflow. As you've seen in earlier things, we can handle both film and colorimetric 16-bit half-float OpenEXRs, which is sort of our standard file format. ADX we support in DPX files, so we have specific support for film scans or Cineon files. We have, that's kind of what all that says. We have a prototyping language called the color transformation language, which is similar to C. It allows you to see exactly how we implemented every transform. It can be turned into C or C++ or GL shader language. There's various things that can be done with that, but it's our reference library of here's how we did the math, and everybody can see it. It's all open. There's no sort of secret sauce anywhere in the system. And then we have test libraries of reference images, so you can run your own transform and see if it comes out the same way as what we had designed. Among the key features of this ASUS 1.0, as I said, was working spaces for color correction and visual effects, adding support for on-set needs, adding lots of metadata and containers for a common LUT format, clip-level metadata, and the look modification transforms, or ASCCDL. We added HDR support for PQ so far. We did some look and feel improvements to the way images are graded. We added versioning. We supported a full, with the help of Sony Pictures ImageWorks, a full open color I/O configuration for ASUS. So all visual effects artist has to do is bring it into their system and select the ASUS configuration, and they have a pipeline set up with the proper LUTs for all the transforms. And then a guideline for developers on how to position the transforms within a user interface. So in overview, we think we've achieved our main goals, which was a source master that can be used across the industry, both film and television production, It's a common color space, a high precision encoding. It can be saved in OpenEXR files with associated metadata files. You can put it on tape or disk or into a library. We have uniform handling of color management, both on the input and the output side, as well as the ability to customize with custom looks within color correctors. This preserves the wide range of color and creative choices that all of the users want to have. So we don't think we've put any handcuffs in the way of people who want to do exotic looks or different choices. We are quickly gaining adoption across wide ranges of facilities. This slide's slightly out of date. It's about a year ago, actually. It was used on Elysium, Oblivion, 101 Dalmatians. Some of the ones on the right are restorations. Justified, a television show. Since then, we've heard of a lot of other shows, especially in Europe. It's pretty common for small facilities to get a certain filmic look out of our base rendering. So they tend to use it, especially when they want that, if they want to make it look big budget, or they don't have color scientists available, they'll adopt ASUS as a common workspace. And one of the surprising companies that used it was the folks who did the Lego movie. They in fact did a 8-bit HDR format for the Lego dailies, so they could look at stuff on their monitors. And they thought it was great because it really preserved highlights and the lighting that they were trying to do. It was a very bright and cheerful movie, so they had lots of glints everywhere, and ASUS was the main enabler of a lot of that look. So here's a list of, in essence, where to go and what to do if you want to dive into any of the details. Oscars.org/ASUS is our landing page. That's where to start to learn about more details. It points to everything else on this, so you don't have to write any of this down. You can get to it all from the Oscars.org page. But we have a ASUS dev repository of all the transforms, images, documentation, and color transforms. We have our CTL, color transformation language, source code, and interpreter. That CTL render runs on Linux, Windows, and Mac. The ASUS container repository is where we have a reference implementation for reading and writing OpenEXR. EXR itself supports some of our stuff in the main EXR libraries, so we've worked closely with ILM since the beginning of the project to make sure we were trying to track what they were doing with EXR and then use the subset that we wanted. And then OpenColor.io as well has built-in support for the workflow. So, and that's also all available, including our Python scripts that generate the LUTs. So we're trying to be as open as possible, so if people are tech heavy and they really want to dive in, they can go all the way, or they can just call their vendor up and say, when am I going to have ASUS in my package that I just bought, because I really want it. And the more of that happens, the more the vendors are going to dive into this stuff. So we do have a large group of people who can be thanked for all this work, because it certainly was not just a few people. Literally, meetings every 6 weeks for at least 8 years, phone calls weekly, lots of testing and experiments with major support from all the camera manufacturers and color corrector vendors. So pretty much everybody you might have heard of making production tools has been paying attention and helping move this stuff along. And it was all in the service of making better color choices, knowing that we have a more significant future coming of wide capability of display devices. So, in summary of everything, HDR is coming really fast as far as the momentum of all the industry folks who are moving towards it. How long it takes to be adopted by consumers is a big question. There will certainly be some chaos as different technologies compete with each other to see who has the best ideas and best implementations. Production is actually ready to do this. It's not that big of a challenge. As I said, most cameras can do 14 or 15 stops of capture range, and having more is always going to be better. So, but we're right there right now. We can make more than enough content to satisfy the displays that are out there. Post is mostly ready, except for it's sometimes hard to find large reference monitors. Going back to 30 inches or 24 inches as you're mastering when we've been using 55 for the past 5 years is kind of tough. Everybody sees the small things like, I don't know if I can use that anymore, although everybody used it for 20 years, but they're used to the, like think about going back in your home and saying, I'm just gonna buy a 20-inch LCD, you know, that's all for my living room, and no, nobody wants to do that. And then lastly, you know, and when I say we here, I'm talking about post-production communities and the studios and content creators around the world. It's getting really tough to make and finish movies. Some of the studio movies I've been involved in, the number of versions that were made for shipping in all the distribution channels is up to somewhere between 350 to 450 versions. And you know, you think, oh, well, that's impossible. I mean, how can you possibly do that? But this stuff, they just breed and they grow. And you know, you come in and sometimes you have edits for different territories. China often has to have a different edit. So, you know, you'll have your main edit, and then they have subordinate edits for different territories. And then each one of those has different languages and different packages for captions. And then, you know, some of them were done for Rec 709, and then some of them in the theaters, you had the 3D version, and you had the 2D version, and you had the 3D version at 10-foot Lamberts, and you had the one for 4-foot Lamberts, and it just keeps growing. I mean, you know, the number of, as we get into HDR, you could imagine the same thing. There'll be a HDR for 400 nits, one for 1,000, one for 2,000, and then every one of those is factored against all of the other changes I just mentioned. So yes, you might have 7 masters, each of which needs 14 languages, each of which has 3 different output formats, because you need HEVC encoding, and you need MPEG-4, and you need, so it just grows. And so when I say the studios are commonly doing 300 or 400 versions, it's all of these distribution chains. It's the airline versions, and it's the Blu-ray, and it's the, you know, downloads, and even Netflix. You may not know this. Netflix has every movie is transcoded to every download speed they might need to use. So the first thing they do is test your download speed, and they already have a movie made at 1 megabit, and one at 2, and one at 3, and one at 7, and they select it, and they send you that version. They know if your TV is a 720p or a 1080. You can sometimes select that in your download window as, do I want the full HD or do I want the small HD? Or do I just have SD, and they do that one. And again, they have all of those. So 70 different versions, that's how they effectively give you good quality. And the studios are no different, but it does get exhausting. So we're trying to manage this process a little bit better. And anything that allows us to re-render and regenerate on the fly lots of new content is a beneficial technique, which is why ASUS is not just a production format, but can also be used later on to reuse the negative in these different chains. So that's really all I really had to say for tonight. So I want to thank you for listening, and I know I babbled and went over too many acronyms, and I could see the glazed eyes on occasion, but you know, it's a wild and dynamic time in the television industry that we haven't seen in, you know, probably 20 years. So it's actually quite exciting to see how fast things are changing, and to know we're going to have something much better in the next decade. I'm looking forward to seeing what I actually have to buy next, because I don't know what it's going to be.